And greetings, everyone. First, let me introduce our distinguished panel. Ian Mundorf is Global Head of Media for HP Inc., overseeing digital and traditional planning. Sorry, Ian, I had those flipped. Duncan McCall is CEO and co-founder of PlaceIQ, a leading location intelligence company, and Caitlin Fennessy is research director at the International Association of Privacy Professionals, the IAPP. And as Cheryl said, I'm Susan Robb, and managing partner at the Customer Data Platform Institute, and I invite you to visit us at cdpinstitute.org. This is a very timely topic. It's an area that was already undergoing significant change as a result of privacy laws like GDPR and CCPA, and now data-driven decision-making is accelerating it. So Ian and Duncan, I'd like to start with you. We hear about, as Cheryl said, the death of third-party cookies. How are you planning for a world without cookies in terms of your marketing, content, and messaging? And what do you see as some of the alternatives?
Well, I think we may have lost Duncan in the middle of that question. So welcome back, Duncan. I'll take a swing at it first.
Okay.
So, as a marketer trying to think about the implications of this, there's a certain amount of just eagerness for us to start exploring what the alternatives could look like in terms of being able to piece this back together. But, first off, we all have to recognize that there's always been problems in terms of the data ecosystem. We know that it's been, frequently overstated in terms of the quality and occasionally downright fraudulent. So in some ways, if we say we are watching an open marketplace that frequently had some poor behavior within it begin to erode, that's not in itself not necessarily a bad thing. And so instead, it becomes an opportunity for us to be able to reconstitute it with higher quality, more transparent data. Part of that is what we can be able to see from independent partners and what they can craft, but where we're really focusing our energy right now at HP is thinking about new types of partnerships that we can begin to develop, especially with the likes of retailers, especially with the likes of resellers, and in some case publishers. Being able to think about endemic content that can be able to get us access to these types of audiences in ways that, again, are much more transparent in terms of how that's being put together. We consider that something of an opportunity. And so while it's obviously a break from what we've really focused on over the course of the past 5 to 10 years, it's not necessarily something that we are highly reluctant to embrace. In some ways, we think it's a great opportunity for us to start thinking about, what is the role of that quality of content? How do we get back to, the old work of media planning to be able to think about reach and composition as a mechanism to be able to get in front of users, as opposed to potentially deluding ourselves about the quality of some of that cookie level data. Of course, not all of it, but in some cases, questionable sources that we've used in the past.
Maybe Caitlin, if you could pick up one, and Ian, how are the increased regulations changing how marketers can obtain customer data?
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that. Thank you.
Okay.
So I think it makes sense to, in that regard, to talk about the regimes that we're looking at in the EU and in California in terms of what they're requiring of marketers and particularly how they address the issue of cookies. So I would start with the EU, and it's a complex landscape. In the EU, as folks likely know, when it comes to cookies, we're seeing that governed by both the GDPR and the e-privacy directive. And of course, as a directive, e-privacy has to be implemented in member state law. And then on top of that, we have differing guidance coming out from across the 27 now, was 28 member state data protection authorities. So in terms of what the GDPR and that regime is requiring, they're requiring consent, basically opt-in consent prior to the placement of a cookie. And the guidance coming from DPAs is basically saying that applies to all cookies except those that are strictly necessary. And where the guidance in the countries are differing is on what strictly necessary means. Sometimes, France and Germany have suggested that analytics cookies, for instance, could be exempt from that opt-in consent. They could be considered strictly necessary, but the UK has pretty firmly said, no, it applies to all cookies. I think, basically in the EU, what we're seeing is a requirement that there be accurate information upfront about what the cookie tracks, documented consent and storage of that consent. Generally speaking, cookie walls aren't considered too acceptable. Spain has hedged on that a little bit. But so, there is just this requirement for consent before you drop that cookie. And then separately, I think California with the CCPA, which is now in effect and which will become enforceable starting in July, even though the regulations aren't quite yet finalized, has taken a totally different approach. And so that's thrown marketers, I think, again, for a loop and driven a lot of the changes that Ian is talking about. And in California, there is not a requirement for that opt-in, upfront opt-in consent. There is a requirement, the main driver in the CCPA is a requirement that individuals must be able to opt out of the, quote unquote, sale of their personal information. So there is no requirement for opt-in consent prior to placing a cookie. But because sale is defined so broadly under the CCPA to include any sharing of information for valuable consideration, it captures a lot of the typical behavioral advertising practices and the ways cookies were used. So then what becomes really important in California is how you can effectuate that opt-out request if someone should act on it. And I think, folks have approached this in two different ways. Something is not considered a sale under the CCPA, and which would require this opt-out ability if it is a transfer to a service provider. So some folks have approached this by trying to create service provider relationships and only let information collected through cookies be used for very direct business purposes. Others have said, that doesn't align with the behavioral advertising model. And I think what we're seeing is basically, either folks are thinking about how they can collect upfront consent, which is tough, but the EU model, or how they can, effectuate that opt-out. And there's different entities out there, whether it's the Direct Advertising Alliance, the Interactive Advertising Bureau, even Google have kind of all approached this in different ways, whether they're banding together and saying, okay, we'll do kind of global opt-outs for you, we'll act on that, or we'll create global service provider agreements, as some of them have done. So it's a challenge, and I think that's why it's so interesting to hear from my co-panelists how they're approaching this.
Yeah. Ian, can you talk to that? And then maybe Duncan, if you have, that was on increased regulations and how that's changing getting data.
Yeah, I mean, I think Caitlin's overview is a beautiful illustration as to exactly how hard it is to be able to address this in terms of a global practice, or for that matter, even a national practice, as we begin to see fragmentation across different state laws. And so we begin to be confronted with an option. We can continue to do the cat and mouse game of trying to see if we can, figure out how closely we can toe the line in terms of this law. Or we can begin to think about new practices that we can either build into our marketing organization or new incentives that we can build out for our customers. For instance, one of the things that we've been talking about is how to be able to provide better services to IT managers who are frequently the ones making choices about what kind of printer or PC you're using in your office. Well, rather than us providing you with a product catalog and say, great, we did what we need to online, how can we create something that really does incentivize you to be able to share more information such that you might be posting onto the site, sharing information with your peers, receiving wisdom from your peers, so that opportunity to interact. And when we ask you if you'd be willing to share some basic information, it might seem like there's actually enough bait on the other end of the line. And sorry, that's a little vulgar of an analogy, but still enough reason that someone would bother to say, I'm comfortable with HP having that data.
And so the next question is, do you see consumers choosing personalization over privacy? And if there is a trade-off on that, how do you manage it? Do you want to each take a brief stab at this one? Ian, do you have a thought on that?
I think this one is fraught because we frequently, see numbers in terms of users really wanting to be able to see the choices that they've made reflected within the advertising that they see. But simultaneously, once we start asking them about some of the particular mechanisms that enable that, which require us to be able to drop cookies, for instance, we see more reluctance. And so I think people have grown accustomed to some environments being able to provide that type of personalization. Certainly when I'm up on Amazon, I'm hoping that they actually understand what type of books I want to purchase. But as I'm being followed around by that book across the wider web, I think people are frequently grossed out by that. And so I think that it's going to be very hard to create a permission infrastructure where people are actually going to say, I want to be followed by that book. I want to be followed by that pair of shoes. And I know that's very hard, and maybe harder even still for those who are in more of a direct-to-consumer mindset. For ourselves, we are a brand that's largely mediated by our retailers and resellers. And so, again, I think this is still a little bit of an opportunity for us to say, how much precision did we have in terms of those signals in the past? Did we really know that they wanted that particular laptop configuration versus just a lightweight laptop? Were they simply trying to choose between HP and Dell? And so for us to be able to retreat a little bit bound to categorical distinctions or even brand level distinctions may actually afford us the opportunity to tell some more compelling stories than we have in the past, as opposed to say, hey, we know you were looking at this thing. Let's just stalk you across the internet until you finally decide to buy the thing. So, different ends of my business will obviously approach this with differing degrees of importance. But again, I do think that this reset is a bit of an opportunity for us to be able to reconsider some of the tools that we've had previously, not simply to work to recreate them in the best ways possible, but to ask ourselves if they really were fulfilling on their promise.
Duncan, do you have something to add to that?
Okay now?
Yeah.
All right, we'll give it a go. So absolutely, in this concept of a value exchange, right? I think historically consumers are very much used to the value exchange of, hey, watching advertisement or being exposed to advertising in terms of free content. So if you kind of go back all the way to the history of the soap opera, right, to understand the idea of the value exchange between advertising and a content or service for free. So if you fast forward that to this reality of, are consumers willing to sort of trade privacy for personalization? I think the way I would reframe that, the answer is, consumers are absolutely willing to trade some level. I think the key question is how much and how do you find that balance, right? Nobody's going to say, look, we want to go back to an internet whereby nothing's remembered, there's no personalization, there's no automatic logins, right? Everybody's used to that now. What we want to be able to say is consumers understand the data they're consenting, they understand what's being used, they have control over it. And look, like any of these things, right? If you go back and you say, data sharing and usage has been around for a long time. You go to the DMV and register a vehicle, the government turns around and sells your data. You move house, the post office, sells your data. That's been around for decades and decades. But we're undergoing this tremendous revolution right now whereby everything is becoming digital. Data is being shared. Consumers are unclear. They don't feel protected. To the previous question, we need regulation so consumers do feel protected. So I do think, yes, there is going to be a trade-off between this concept of privacy and digital data sharing and personalization. It's going to take some time to get there, but that's why we need to have more conversations like this.
Yeah, and that's where we were headed. So Caitlin, just a quick, more or less one. Do you think for a survey question, consumers will be more or less concerned about privacy as a result of coronavirus?
Yeah, no, that is a great question, and one we're spending a lot of time looking at the IAPP. As I think so many folks listening in know, privacy is at the heart of so many issues around COVID-19 right now. I mean, I feel like it's in every major news story. So I really do think that some of those issues could spur the legislative action that Duncan is pointing to, and they really have kind of helped privacy rise to the forefront. In some of the survey data, so we worked with EY to put out a survey earlier this spring, and very quickly got responses from over 900 privacy professionals. Clearly, this issue is top of mind. And we really see them grappling with three major privacy issues that I'll just kind of cite. The privacy and security issues associated with remote work, those associated with employee health monitoring, and then those related to data sharing. And I think, really we're typically thinking about data sharing in the context of combating COVID-19. But some of us were discussing earlier that there's another major issue of significant interest to our audience here that has real privacy implications, which is just that as we are not all gathering in person, it's a lot harder for marketers to kind of understand their audience, whether it's the type of insights you might glean from conferences or the like. In a virtual environment, there's often a lot more data needed just to understand those you are serving, and that will bring with it privacy implications. And then the question is, how can you maintain your user trust in a world of increased data sharing, whether it's to combat COVID-19 or for marketing purposes? So I think it will be something, privacy professionals will be grappling with in the coming years quite a bit.
Yeah, actually, on our survey results, so people know, and the panel has that more than 87% felt that consumers would be more concerned. So I don't think that's a big surprise. So Ian and Duncan, so then it comes to the question of how this may impact data-driven decision-making, and just if you want to say your thoughts on what do you think about the future of data and its implications tied to privacy? That's a big question. Yeah. For a few minutes.
Yeah. I'll take a crack at that. So absolutely. So if you think of this construct of firstly, sort of data-driven decision-making, and place like Q, the location data company, and you can imagine that during these unprecedented disruptive times, if you have stores in the physical world, you have automotive dealerships, you have a product or service that's transacted at a physical location, everything just changed in a way that nobody's ever experienced, right? Some stores going down, some going up, different regions, different types of people. So making a data-driven decision is more important than ever. And we'd seen, look, we got lucky enough to have a whole bunch of customers who were using data to make decisions. But more than ever, we've had customers that never really worked with us before say, we need help. We don't know what the hell is going on. How do we think about, we want to cut our marketing spend. Where should we cut it? We're no longer just have, blanket national campaigns. We've got to think about localization. How are we doing versus our competitors? So I think on the first point, absolutely, if you were not doing data-driven decision-making now in your business in general, you damn well better be doing it. Otherwise, you're going to be in serious trouble because everything just changed and you need data to make better decisions. And then this whole point of, the sort of last question and this new question as well, the future of privacy. I think COVID has kind of changed the conversation in a way, because there used to be these two camps of, digital data is bad, digital data is good. And like many conversations, you can't just make it a binary, simple thing. I think now there's, hey, we can use data to save people's lives. So we got to rethink that narrative. And look, I'm just super confident. I remember when my dad, you wouldn't use a credit card on the internet, right? You go back to the 90s, everybody thought the internet was, some niche thing. Wait, put a credit card on the internet? Are you crazy? I think we'll look back on this time and say, look, we wrestled with these questions around privacy and digital data and usage. And just as we have in any other industry or any other technology, We will find a way to strike a sensible balance, to write some regulation. It'll take a while and it'll be a wandering path to get there, but we are super bullish about the long-term future of digital data and decision-making for the good of companies and consumers and everybody.
And Caitlin, we have about a minute, so your thought on that?
I don't know if you meant to go to Ian, since I've chimed in.
Okay. No, that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll jump in real quick. You know, from the perspective of from my perspective, just, what Duncan shows, I think, is a really interesting approach to the future of data, whereas I think we have largely thought about this as a one-to-one addressability question. How can we begin to think about data as perhaps being more of the infrastructure for customer intelligence, being able to understand where there are over indices, understanding where we think that we're more likely to be able to act. And it may not be quite as automated such that we can just throw it into a DSP and know that we're going to be serving ads, but at least enough so that we can start making informed decisions. And so I do think that the digital ecosystem that we spent the past decade building up is still going to be highly, highly important for us to be able to put to use. The form that it takes just might be different. It may not be as precise. It may be flocks. It may be turtle doves. I don't know what it looks like. But still, as we try and figure out what these specific protocols are, it's going to be a slightly, broader, coarser grain, but it doesn't mean that it prevents us from being able to make more intelligent decisions about how to reach our customers and what to reach them with.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks, everybody. And I'm going to turn this back over to Cheryl.